In September 1944, a coordinated group of highly trained American submarines flawlessly executed a naval ambush in the Pacific, only to discover, 3 days later, that they had just slaughtered over 1,000 of their own Allied soldiers.
Yeah. And then, if we look decades later in April 2012, actually the United States Coast Guard intercepted a 164-foot Japanese fishing vessel. It was just slowly traversing the Alaskan coast.
Right.
They aimed their deck cannons, and they just opened fire on the ship until it sank into the freezing depths.
Yeah.
And the reason they did that, because the massive steel vessel had absolutely no one on board.
It's just wild. We are talking about two entirely different eras, right? Separated by nearly 70 years. I mean, one event is defined by the absolute height of human conflict, and the other by the catastrophic aftermath of a geological event.
Exactly. Yet both of these historical records are governed by the exact same mechanism. It's the terrifying, completely indifferent physics of the ocean.
I want you to picture the reality of that environment for a moment. Just imagine staring out into the pitch-black void of the open ocean at night. You're hundreds of miles from the nearest continental shelf.
And there is no moon. No ambient light pollution reflecting off the cloud cover.
Right, the darkness is absolute. It's pressing against your retinas. The water temperature is hovering just of freezing. And beneath your feet is not a solid foundation. It's an unfathomable vertical drop.
Yeah, thousands of feet of crushing hydrostatic pressure extending straight down to the abyssal plain.
We tend to view the ocean as a surface we travel across, right? But it is a three-dimensional, highly kinetic fluid environment. Out there, the normal rules of terrestrial civilization simply evaporate. You are an exceptionally fragile biological organism suspended in an alien world.
And that biological fragility is really the core of today's analysis because, we map the ocean floor with sonar, we track shipping lanes with satellites, and we engineer these vessels capable of displacing tens of thousands of tons of water.
Which makes us feel safe.
Right? It creates this illusion of mastery. But the ocean is not a controlled medium. It is an untamed wilderness of fluid dynamics and thermodynamic energy transfers.
So today, we are analyzing two specific maritime nightmares where humanity's technological and societal structures completely broke down, leaving humans and the machines they build entirely at the mercy of that wilderness.
It's a dark reality to face.
It really is. We are going to reconstruct the destruction of the SS Rakuyō Maru in 1944 and the eerie trans-Pacific drift of the Ryou-Un Maru in 2011. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to travel back to the Pacific theater of World War II. Let's start by stepping aboard the first vessel.
Right, the SS Rakuyō Maru.
Yeah, the Rakuyō Maru was a 9,419-ton passenger cargo ship. It was built in 1921 by Mitsubishi Shipbuilding in Nagasaki.
To really understand the physical reality of this ship, you have to look at maritime engineering in the early 1920s.
Okay.
The Rakuyō Maru was a product of the post-World War I industrial boom in Japan. We are talking about 460 feet of riveted steel plating, and it was powered by these massive coal-fired steam turbines turning twin screws.
So it was a substantial piece of machinery.
Oh, absolutely. For nearly 20 years, she operated under the Nippon Yusen shipping line as a symbol of commercial progress. She featured large cargo holds for trade goods and compartmentalized passenger decks for civilian transit.
But, the architecture of a 1920s commercial liner becomes a massive structural liability when forced into the logistics of total war.
Yes, it does.
By 1944, the Japanese Empire supply lines were basically collapsing. They desperately needed transport capacity, so they stripped the Rakuyō Maru of her commercial identity.
And they didn't just repaint her.
No, they fundamentally altered her internal layout to maximize human cargo. They transformed her into a military troopship, specifically what became known as a hell ship.
And we should clarify the term hell ship refers specifically to the brutal, entirely unregulated transport of prisoners of war by the Japanese Imperial Navy.
Right.
In early September 1944, the Rakuyō Maru was incorporated into convoy HI-72. They were departing from Singapore en route to Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan.
And the cargo they loaded into the lower decks, it just defies basic biological sustainment.
It's horrifying.
They packed 1,317 Australian and British POWs into the ship's lower cargo holds. And just for context, she was accompanied by the Kachidoki Maru, which was carrying another 950 Allied POWs and 1,095 Japanese personnel.
Yeah, let's break down the mechanics of that environment on the Rakuyō Maru, because saying they were packed in really doesn't capture the horror of it.
Not at all. It's like a sealed steel tomb.
Exactly. These holes were deep within the hull, well below the waterline, entirely encased in steel,
Yeah.
and they were engineered to hold crates of rubber or machinery, not respiring human beings.
Right. You have 1,317 men crammed into a space so tight that their knees are literally pressed into the backs of the men in front of them.
And consider the climate. The tropical heat in the South China Sea in September routinely pushes the ambient temperature above 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which is brutal on its own.
But inside a sealed steel box with zero active ventilation, the thermodynamic reality is lethal. The collective body heat and the exhalation of carbon dioxide would have spiked the internal temperature well over 110 degrees,
God.
creating this suffocating, completely hypoxic environment.
And I have to push back here on the sheer logistical nightmare of this. How could anyone survive just the transit, let alone what was about to happen?
Well, we must factor in the physical condition of these men before they even boarded. These were survivors of the fall of Singapore.
Right.
Many had survived the systemic starvation and forced labor of the Burma Railway. Their bodies were already feeling from severe caloric deficits, beriberi, malaria, dysentery.
There were no bathrooms down there.
No sanitation infrastructure whatsoever. The men were forced to use open wooden buckets that quickly overflowed as the ship rolled in the ocean swells. So the chemical exposure to raw ammonia from human waste, combined with the extreme heat, it meant that the air itself became toxic.
It is effectively an acoustic and atmospheric torture chamber. But what I find even more psychologically devastating is the tactical reality these POWs faced.
What do you mean?
Well, they were experienced combatants, right? They understood the strategic map. They knew they were being transported in an unmarked Japanese vessel straight through the Luzon Strait, which is a choke point aggressively patrolled by the United States Navy.
The psychological paradox here is intense. On a battlefield, you can maneuver, you can seek cover, you can surrender.
You have options.
Right. But trapped in a ship's hold in the middle of the ocean, your agency is reduced to zero. The POWs knew that the Allies had established superiority beneath the surface of the Pacific.
Yeah.
Therefore, they understood that the most imminent, lethal threat to their survival was not the Japanese guards standing on the deck above them. It was their own Allied forces hunting in the water below.
It's a waking nightmare. They were essentially serving as human shields, blindfolded and locked in a steel drum. Which brings us to the morning of September 12, 1944. Convoy HI-72 is navigating the Luzon Strait, that body of water connecting the Philippine Sea to the South China Sea.
And the hydrodynamics of this strait make it notoriously treacherous. It's characterized by severe tidal currents and frequent typhoons.
But the threat they encountered that morning was entirely mechanical. Waiting for the convoy was a U.S. Navy submarine wolf pack. Specifically, the USS Growler, the USS Pampanito, and the USS Sealion.
Right, the wolf pack doctrine was designed to overwhelm convoy escorts. By operating in coordinated groups, submarines could attack from multiple vectors simultaneously.
Which forces the defensive destroyers to scatter their depth charge patterns, right?
Precisely, it breaks their defense. In the early hours of September 12, the Wolfpack initiated their attack sequence. It was the USS Sealion that acquired the Rakuyō Maru through its periscope optics, and they fired their torpedoes.
Let's analyze the physics of a World War II torpedo strike, because I think people assume it's just a surface-level explosion like an artillery shell.
Oh, it's completely different. A Mark 14 torpedo carried nearly 650 pounds of Torpex, high explosive.
Wow.
When it detonates against the side of a ship, it isn't just punching a hole in the metal. The explosion creates a massive, rapidly expanding bubble of superheated gas underwater.
And because water is non-compressible.
Exactly. That explosive energy has nowhere to go but straight into the hull of the ship. The kinetic energy transfer is catastrophic. The shockwave hits the hull at thousands of feet per second.
So those old riveted seams of a 1921 vessel would just violently shear apart?
Yes. The massive steel plates buckle and tear. And for the men locked in that pitch-black hold, the sensory experience would have been incomprehensible. The deafening acoustic shock of the blast would shatter eardrums instantly.
And the concussive force traveling through the steel deck, that would shatter the bones of anyone sitting directly on the metal, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
And immediately following the shockwave is the influx of the ocean. You are sitting in total darkness. Suddenly, the entire structure of your universe screams as the steel tears open, and freezing seawater blasts into the compartment at hundreds of gallons per second, highly pressurized by the depth.
It's terrifying.
But the brutal, agonizing reality of the Rakuyō Maru is that it did not suffer a catastrophic, instantaneous structural failure. It didn't snap in half and sink in 2 minutes. The torpedo crippled her, but she sank slowly.
Yes, this is a function of the ship's compartmentalization.
Yeah.
Water rushed into the damaged sections, which drastically altered the ship's buoyancy and caused a severe list, but the intact bulkheads temporarily held back the total flooding.
Right.
The historical records indicate she was struck in the morning but did not fully slip beneath the surface until the evening.
Which creates an excruciating timeline. It wasn't a sudden merciful end. It was hours of creeping dread, panic, and desperate scrambling. It turns the sinking ship into a flooding, multi-level labyrinth. The POWs had to navigate in absolute terrifying darkness. The ship is listing heavily, so the floors are steeply angled. They're climbing over the dead and wounded, feeling their way up iron ladders, trying to pry open locked steel hatches while the water rises around their waists and chests.
They essentially have to fight their way out of a sinking steel tomb.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is, well, devastating really, is the fog of war. The commanders of the Sealion, the Pampanito, and the Growler were executing their strategic objective flawlessly.
Because from their perspective, they were hitting a military target.
Exactly. They tracked a high-value Japanese troop transport and eliminated it. They had absolutely no intelligence signaling that the vessel was carrying 1,317 Allied prisoners.
And you have to wonder, how does that happen logistically? It seems like a massive failure of intelligence. But it's actually a deliberate manipulation of maritime law by the Japanese military.
Yes, under the Geneva Conventions, a vessel transporting prisoners of war must be clearly marked traditionally with a large, illuminated red cross to grant it immunity from attack.
Which the Japanese Imperial Navy systematically rejected.
Completely. They intentionally deployed unmarked cargo ships to move troops, munitions, and raw materials, and simply shoved POWs into the lower decks of those same vessels.
So to the sonar operator and the periscope commander on an American submarine, the acoustic signature and the visual profile of the Rakuyō Maru were identical to a legitimate military target.
Right. The American submariners believed they were severing the logistical spine of the Japanese war machine. In reality, they were executing their own men.
God. So the men who managed to force their way out of the holds and onto the listing deck of the Rakuyō Maru now face the reality of an evacuation. The ship is dying. The Japanese escorts, the naval destroyers tasked with protecting the convoy, move into the debris field.
But they don't execute a general rescue operation.
No. They maneuver their ships exclusively to retrieve the Japanese crew and military personnel.
The triage protocol here was based entirely on military utility and, frankly, deep-seated prejudice. The Japanese naval doctrine of the era viewed prisoners of war as disgraced combatants. They believed these men had forfeited their honor by surrendering rather than dying in battle. Consequently, they expended zero resources to save them.
Unbelievable.
The escort vessels pulled their own sailors from the water, throttled at their engines, and simply abandoned the area.
They left over 1,000 battered, starved men floating in the vast, churning waters of the Luzon Strait. The POWs were left clinging to wooden planks, shattered crates, a few rudimentary life rafts, and a handful of lifeboats that the Japanese had left behind.
It's a death sentence.
Let's quantify this loss before we move on. 11,159 Allied prisoners of war drowned or died of exposure following the sinking of the Rakuyō Maru.
That casualty figure is just staggering, and it represents a profound loss of human capital. Among the dead was Winston Ide, a highly celebrated Australian rugby union player, and Brigadier Arthur Varley.
Right. Varley was a renowned Australian commander who had miraculously kept his men alive through the construction of the Burma Railway, only to perish in the Pacific. But the tragedy doesn't end with the sinking. The next chronological event pushes this narrative past the horrors of a shipwreck and into the realm of a maritime massacre.
Yeah, this part is incredibly dark.
We move to the next day, September 13th. Against all mathematical odds, a group of about 350 POWs have managed to commandeer a small flotilla of abandoned wooden lifeboats. They have oars, they are out of the water, and they are attempting to row toward land.
At this point, a Japanese Navy warship intercepts them.
And tactically, you might assume this vessel would either capture the men to reclaim their labor value, or just simply ignore them, since they pose no offensive threat.
Right, they are starving men in wooden rowboats. But instead, the warship opens fire on the lifeboats.
They don't just fire warning shots. They train their naval artillery directly onto clusters of tiny wooden rowboats packed with unarmed, emaciated men. They bombard them until all 350 survivors are obliterated. I just imagine surviving the torpedo, surviving the sinking, surviving the freezing night in the water, finally getting into a lifeboat. Finally feeling a shred of hope. only to see a warship turn its guns on your rowboat. I struggle to comprehend the psychological framework that allows a naval crew to execute that order.
It's not a heat of battle decision.
No. It is the deliberate, mechanical slaughter of shipwreck victims.
We have to examine this through the lens of institutional brutalization. The Japanese military apparatus of 1944 operated under an extreme interpretation of the Bushido Code, which fundamentally dehumanized the enemy.
Right. They didn't see them as human.
To the gunnery crews on that warship, the men in the lifeboats were not fellow mariners in distress. They were discarded property of a defeated enemy force. They were vermin. The act of firing on them was an exercise in absolute power and cruelty.
It represents the total collapse of the ancient maritime code, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The code historically dictated that the sea is the ultimate enemy, and all sailors must assist those drowning in it.
But here, the sea was used as an accomplice. This massacre leaves the remaining survivors, the men without lifeboats, the men clinging to loose wreckage scattered across the open ocean.
Adrift.
Yeah. We are now entering a 3-day window of absolute biological degradation. From September 12th to September 15th, these men drifted. Let's break down the pathology of what happens to the human body during 72 hours of open ocean exposure.
The environmental assault is relentless. First, you have the severe thermal fluctuations. During the day, the equatorial sun reflects off the water, exposing the men to extreme ultraviolet radiation,
which results in 2nd and 3rd degree sunburns.
Right. And the heat accelerates diaphoresis sweating, which rapidly depletes their internal water reserves. Dehydration sets in, thickening the blood and forcing the heart to work exponentially harder.
Then the sun goes down and the thermal dynamic reverses. The water temperature might be 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds warm to us on land, but water conducts heat away from the human body 25 times faster than air.
Yes. Overnight, these emaciated men, lacking any insulating body fat, begin to suffer from acute hypothermia. Their core temperature drops, their motor functions fail, and they begin to shiver violently.
Burning whatever microscopic caloric reserves they have left.
Exactly. And compounding this is the chemical reality of the shipwreck. When a vessel the size of the Rakuyō Maru sinks, its fuel tanks rupture, releasing thousands of gallons of heavy bunker oil.
Oh man, the oil.
The men floating in the debris field were coated in this toxic sludge. It coated their skin, trapping the heat during the day and causing severe chemical burns.
And when the waves crashed over them, they ingested it.
Yeah. Swallowing bunker oil induces severe chemical pneumonitis in the lungs and aggressive vomiting, which further accelerates their lethal dehydration.
And in their delirium, some men inevitably surrender to their thirst and drink the seawater.
Which is the worst thing you can do.
The biology of that decision is fatal. Seawater has a salinity level far higher than human blood. When you ingest it, your kidneys require more water to flush the excess sodium out of your system than the seawater actually provided.
It triggers a process of rapid cellular osmosis. It is literally sucking the water out of your cells,
inducing severe neurological dysfunction, hallucinations, and rapid organ failure.
Furthermore, we must acknowledge the apex predators of this environment.
The sharks.
Right. The acoustic signature of a sinking ship, the tearing metal, the underwater explosions, travels for miles and highly attracts pelagic sharks, specifically the oceanic whitetip.
Because they can feel it.
Yes. The lateral line sensory organs of these sharks detect the low-frequency vibrations of hundreds of men thrashing in the water. The psychological terror of dangling your legs in the dark water, feeling the movement of unseen predators beneath you while your body shuts down is the absolute limit of human endurance.
But on September 15th, the mechanics of the ocean brought a highly improbable variable back into the equation. The U.S. submarines, the Growler, the Pampanito, and the Sealion patrolled back through the exact coordinates of their attack.
They were conducting standard damage assessment and looking for floating intelligence or remaining Japanese targets.
And as the submarines surfaced among the vast debris field, the crew on the conning towers began to spot the rafts. Initially, they assumed they were looking at Japanese survivors.
Naturally. But as the submarines carefully maneuvered closer, the acoustic reality shifted. The submariners heard the survivors shouting, and they recognized the distinct cadences of British and Australian English.
Can you imagine? The realization on the bridge of those submarines must have been paralyzing. The commander realizes in real time that the target he successfully eliminated 3 days ago was a prison ship. And he is now looking at his own allies, covered in oil, dying in the water.
The operational protocols of a submarine in a combat zone immediately conflict with the moral imperative to rescue.
Because a sub is vulnerable.
Extremely. A submarine is at its most vulnerable when surfaced on the open ocean. It takes time to pull slippery, physically incapacitated men out of the water and down through those narrow hatches.
Doing so exposes the submarine to Japanese aerial patrols.
Right. Yet the crews of the Wolfpack immediately initiated rescue operations. They transformed their predatory vessels into lifeboats.
The physical act of pulling these men from the water is a brutal mechanical challenge. The survivors lacked the muscle function to grip a rope.
So the submariners had to dive into the oil-slick water themselves.
Yeah, they dive in, tie ropes around the POWs, and physically haul them up the curved steel hulls. They managed to rescue 149 men, just 149 out of the 317 that were in the hold of the Ryou-Un Maru.
However, the biological damage sustained during those 3 days was irreversible for some.
How so?
Well, the rescue itself triggers profound physiological shock. When a human body has been starving and freezing for days, abruptly reintroducing warmth, fluids, and food can trigger refeeding syndrome. It's a fatal shift in fluids and electrolytes.
So even safety was dangerous.
Exactly. 4 of the rescued men died inside the submarines before they could even be transported to the naval hospital at Tanapag Harbor in Saipan.
The ocean exacted its toll regardless of human intervention. So what does this all mean? The SS Rakuyō Maru stands as a harrowing blueprint of how humans weaponize the ocean against each other.
We engineer the steel boxes, we fire the torpedoes, and we turn the artillery on the lifeboats.
Right, but the ocean is merely the venue for that cruelty. I want to transition now to a completely different horror, a scenario where humanity is completely removed from the equation. What happens when the ocean itself claims a vessel, strips it of its human crew, but categorically refuses to sink it?
We are shifting our focus from the ballistic violence of naval warfare to the sheer kinetic violence of fluid dynamics. We move forward in time to March 11, 2011.
To understand the genesis of this next maritime event, we must analyze the geophysical mechanics of the Tōhoku earthquake and tsunami.
Right. We are talking about a magnitude 9.0 megathrust earthquake occurring in the subduction zone off the coast of Japan. The Pacific tectonic plate violently shoved itself beneath the Okhotsk plate.
This sudden, violent displacement of the Earth's crust thrust a massive volume of the ocean floor upwards. It displaced billions of tons of seawater in a matter of seconds.
This doesn't just create a wave. It creates a highly energized displacement of the entire water column moving at the speed of a commercial jetliner toward the Japanese coastline.
When that displacement reaches the shallow coastal shelf, the energy compresses and the water column builds vertically, forming a devastating tsunami. It was a wall of surging, churning fluid dynamics that physically remapped the coastline,
Obliterating infrastructure and reaching miles inland.
and anchored in a small harbor in Hokkaido, directly in the path of this kinetic energy, was a commercial fishing vessel named the Ryou-Un Maru.
Let's define the physical parameters of the Ryou-Un Maru. This is not a recreational fiberglass boat.
Far from it.
This is a 164-foot, 50-meter industrial Japanese fishing trawler. It is a monolithic structure of heavy-gauge steel, engineered specifically to endure the brutal freezing conditions of the North Pacific Ocean.
And it was securely berthed in the harbor, right? Lashed to the concrete docks with massive high-tensile mooring lines.
But the tensile strength of human engineering is mathematically irrelevant against a 9.0 magnitude tsunami.
Right. When the surging wall of water impacted the harbor, the Ryou-Un Maru was violently lifted. The hydrostatic pressure and the kinetic force of the water instantly exceeded the braking strength of the mooring lines.
The thick cables just snapped.
And the ocean abducted the vessel. It was churned within the massive debris field of the receding water. And as the tsunami drew back into the deep ocean, it dragged the 164-foot steel ship with it, launching it into the vast expanse of the Pacific.
This event effectively births a mechanical phantom.
It's like a zombie wandering the ocean. The Ryou-Un Maru becomes a colossal, uncrewed mass of steel adrift in the void. Let's look at the mechanics of this isolation. The engines are entirely offline.
The navigation computers are dead.
The radio transponders are silent. There is no captain, no fuel being burned, no rudder control. It is thousands of tons of metal surrendered entirely to the unpredictable fluid dynamics of the sea.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows how the ocean can weaponize human engineering. The fact that this 164-foot vessel survived the violent, churning debris field of the coastal tsunami and entered the open ocean completely intact, it's a testament to 2 things.
What are they?
First, the robust, watertight compartmentalization of its steel hull, and second, the sheer chaotic luck of fluid physics.
Because it got caught in a current, right?
Yes. The ship was caught in the Kuroshio Current. It's a powerful, warm ocean current that acts as a massive conveyor belt flowing eastwards from Japan across the North Pacific.
For over a year, this ghost ship executed a silent drift across the largest body of water on the planet. I want you to feel the eerie, physical reality of that journey. 12 continuous months in the dark. Completely alone. The ship is silently cresting over massive 50-foot rogue swells, passing straight through the eye walls of typhoons and drifting under the stars.
And the degradation of the vessel over that year would have been extensive. The marine environment is highly corrosive. Galvanic corrosion would begin attacking the metal immediately.
The heavy salt spray would calcify on the windows of the bridge.
But more importantly, marine fouling barnacles, algae, and seaweed would heavily encrust the hull below the waterline. This organic growth radically alters the hydrodynamics of the ship.
It slows its drift and pulls it deeper into the water.
Exactly. The only acoustic emissions from this vessel would be the heavy groaning of the rusted steel torsion plates flexing in the waves and the wind howling through the empty rigging.
Now, in modern times, we assume the ocean is under constant surveillance, right? We assume satellites and radars are tracking everything. But the reality of maritime navigation is heavily dependent on cooperative technology. A ship is only visible if it wants to be seen.
Which brings us to March of 2012.
Right. Canadian aerial patrols finally spotted the Ryou-Un Maru. It had crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and was slowly drifting into U.S. and Canadian navigational waters near the coast of Alaska.
The discovery of a modern ghost ship immediately generates intense public speculation, often fueled by nautical mythology.
Oh, the internet went wild.
Theories rapidly circulated regarding the potential contents of the ship. Were there survivors of the tsunami trapped on board who slowly starved to death over the year? Were there skeletal remains?
We need to definitively state the historical fact here. When the authorities finally executed a flyover and assessed the Ryou-Un Maru, wait, it was completely empty. That's almost more unsettling. It's just this dead, hollow shell of a ship haunting the shipping lanes.
Yes, it was entirely empty. There were no bodies. There was no tragic final logbook. It was merely a hollow, rusting shell of a ship.
But the fact that it was empty, why is that so dangerous?
The fact that it was empty is vital to understanding the specific mechanical hazard it presented. An uncrewed, unpowered, 164-foot steel ship is not merely a spooky anomaly. It is a highly lethal threat to modern global shipping.
Because of the tracking systems.
Exactly. The entire infrastructure of international maritime trade relies on the Automated Identification System, or AIS. Ships broadcast their position, speed, and heading to each other constantly.
So if you aren't broadcasting on AIS, you effectively don't exist to the computers running modern cargo ships.
Precisely. We suffer from a severe maritime spatial blindness. Modern container ships are enormous, moving at 20 knots and operating with minimal crew. The bridge officers rely almost entirely on active radar.
But marine radar works by bouncing radio waves off reflective surfaces, right?
Right. And the Ryou-Un Maru had no power, no lights, and no active transponder. Furthermore, it was sitting low in the water, and its hull was covered in heavily textured, non-reflective rust and biological growth.
It's essentially acting like a stealth bomber. We think of stealth technology as highly advanced angles and radar-absorbing paint, but the ocean naturally created a stealth ship.
It did.
By stripping its power and coating it in non-reflective rust, the sea basically cloaked a 160-foot steel building from modern technology. Imagine being on a fast-moving passenger ferry at night, trusting your radar screen which shows clear water ahead.
And suddenly,
right out of the darkness, a 50-meter wall of silent, jagged steel rises up on the crest of a wave directly in front of your bow. A collision with a vessel of that mass would violently breach the hull of most commercial ships, leading to catastrophic flooding and loss of life.
due to this severe navigational hazard, international maritime authorities could not allow the Ryou-Un Maru to continue its drift.
So what do? The standard protocol for a disabled vessel is a towing operation, isn't it?
Usually, yes. However, the structural integrity of the ship was heavily compromised by a year of severe corrosion and the initial trauma of the tsunami. Attaching massive towing cables in the heavy swells of the Gulf of Alaska presented an unacceptable risk to the salvage crews.
Because the cables could easily rip the rusted mooring cleats right out of the deck, causing a fatal snapback.
Correct.
So if they can't tow it and they can't board it to plant explosives because the decks might collapse, they're left with only one mechanical solution. We reach the surreal conclusion of the Ryou-Un Maru's journey: execution by cannon fire.
The United States Coast Guard cutter Anacapa, was dispatched to intercept the ghost ship on April 5, 2012. Their mission was to intentionally sink the vessel to protect the shipping lanes.
So they pull up next to it.
The Anacapa positioned itself at a safe distance and utilized its primary deck guns, likely a 25mm autocannon, to systematically dismantle the structural integrity of the Ryou-Un Maru.
The ballistics of sinking a ship with a deck gun require precision, though. You can't just shoot the superstructure. You have to puncture the hull right at the waterline to force the ocean inside.
Right. The Coast Guard unleashed high-explosive, armor-piercing rounds into the rusted flanks of this phantom ship. But the Ryou-Un Maru was a heavily over-engineered industrial vessel. It absorbed the cannon fire for hours.
Wow.
The Coast Guard had to methodically blast away the watertight bulkheads, allowing the freezing Alaskan waters to aggressively flood the internal compartments.
Finally, the hydrostatic pressure inside the hull equalized with the ocean outside, destroying the vessel's buoyancy. The Ryou-Un Maru heavily pitched forward and slipped beneath the surface, spiraling down thousands of feet to the dark, freezing floor of the Gulf of Alaska, officially terminating its year-long journey.
It's a spectacular, explosive end to an empty ship. But the phenomenon of the ghost ship forces us to confront a much darker mechanical reality of the ocean.
Yeah.
The Ryou-Un Maru was a benign, empty relic of a geological disaster. But we have to analyze what happens when a ghost ship is not empty, when the mechanics of isolation claim human lives.
Here's where it gets really interesting and profoundly dark.
We must look at a deeply disturbing maritime pattern that emerged on the western coastline of Japan in late 2017. Authorities began discovering a high frequency of ghost boats washing ashore.
And these are entirely different from the massive steel hull of the Ryou-Un Maru.
Completely different. These were crude, flat-bottomed wooden vessels, heavily degraded by the sea.
Wooden boats degrade completely differently than steel. Wood absorbs water, it rots, it waterlogs, making the vessel sluggish and highly unstable in open ocean swells. But the true horror of these boats wasn't their construction.
It was their cargo. Inside the cramped, dark hulls of these small wooden boats, the Japanese Coast Guard found multiple sets of heavily decomposed skeletal remains.
Forensic and geopolitical analysis strongly indicates these vessels originated from North Korea.
Yes, the mechanics of this tragedy are driven by severe economic and political pressures. Facing extreme food shortages and draconian fishing quotas imposed by the state, poorly equipped North Korean fishermen were forced to push further and further out into the treacherous, unpredictable waters of the Sea of Japan.
They are operating primitive vessels. They have crude, unreliable diesel engines, insufficient fuel, and zero modern navigational telemetry.
No GPS, no radios, no distress beacons.
If the engine throws a rod, or if a sudden storm blows them off their coastal bearing, they are instantly condemned. They are plunged into the exact same fluid dynamics of isolation that the Ryou-Un Maru experienced, but they are trapped on board.
Without sails or propulsion, the wooden boats become captive to the ocean currents. The mechanics of starvation and dehydration at sea take over.
Over a period of weeks or even months, the crew slowly succumbs to the biological realities we discussed earlier with the POWs. Hyperthermia, hypernatremia from drinking seawater, and systemic organ failure.
They die slowly in the dark, and the ocean effortlessly preserves their wooden tombs, drifting them across the sea until they finally run aground on a foreign shore.
This strips away the romanticized veneer we often place on the ocean. It brings our entire analysis full circle, connecting these wooden ghost boats directly back to the hellish steel hulls of the Rakuyō Maru.
Whether you are analyzing 1,317 trained soldiers trapped in a militarized steel ship or 8 desperate fishermen dying on a wooden skiff, the mechanical reality of the ocean remains absolute.
The central thematic anchor of these events is the ocean's total indifference to human architecture and human suffering. The ocean does not recognize the geopolitics of World War II, nor does it care about the economic desperation of modern fishermen.
The absolute isolation of being adrift strips away the entire facade of civilization. It removes borders, technology, and maritime law, reducing humanity to a primal mechanical struggle for biological survival against a fluid environment that possesses infinite kinetic energy.
The ocean is a giant, indifferent recycling machine. During the height of human conflict, it swallowed the shattered hull of the Rakuyō Maru, claiming over 1,000 lives without hesitation.
Decades later, it harnessed the energy of an earthquake to effortlessly snap the steel chains of the Ryou-Un Maru, carrying it across the globe simply because that is how the currents flow.
We forge these massive metal structures, we launch them into the water, and we arrogantly assume we've paved over the wilderness.
But the ocean merely tolerates our presence on its surface. When our engines fail, when our structural integrity is breached, the ocean immediately reclaims our engineering. It transforms our greatest technological achievements into floating prisons, into deep-water coffins, or into silent, rusted phantoms drifting endlessly through the fog.
At the beginning of this deep dive, I asked you to imagine the pitch-black void of the open ocean, the freezing water, the fathomless depth beneath you, and the absolute lack of light.
The darkness.
As we close this analysis, I want to leave you with a functional application of that imagery. We established that modern maritime tracking is heavily flawed, suffering from spatial blindness when transponders fail. Given the absolute incomprehensible vastness of the Pacific Ocean, and given how a 164-foot steel stealth ship like the Ryou-Un Maru drifted completely undetected for an entire year,
Right.
consider what else is out there. Think about the fluid dynamics of the ocean right now, tonight. How many unmanned, silent ghost ships are currently drifting just beyond the edge of our radar screens, sliding silently through the pitch-black water, carrying undocumented histories, silent tragedies, and perhaps maritime horrors that the ocean simply hasn't returned to us yet?